Look under the motorcycle. The scream tore through the alley like a match struck on wet pavement, sharp, raw, begging. And whatever small world Mara had been clinging to for the last 12 months bristled and opened at the sound. Rain slapped the corrugated roofs, steam rose from the manhole and curled around the hulking shapes of abandoned Harleys. Her hand felt numb, fingers slick as she dragged back the dented gas tank of a derelict bike, and something in her chest keyed into a pitch of panic that made her legs give. She wasn't expecting anyone. She certainly wasn't expecting him. Wait. Before the next revelation unfolds, if this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. He moved like a storm that had learned patience, slow, inevitable. Jace Rook Mercer knelt without flinching, the black of his jacket soaking up the rain into a darker shadow. The Brotherhood cut of him was as obvious as the white skull stitched on his back. President, 39, Iron Jaw, scars that read like a ledger of past fights. He smelled of oil and smoke and something older, tobacco and leather, a living road. Mara expected to be shoved aside, cursed at, or ignored. Instead, he looked at what she'd found with a soft, terrible attention that made the alley feel too small. He drew the metal free with one hand and then the other, because he was practiced in holding the unwanted. A rusted locket thudded into his palm, its hinge stuck, its chain a knotted promise. When it opened, a faded photograph inside slid up, edges frayed. The ink bled by time and rain into a ghost of a face. Mara's throat closed tight enough to stop the sound of the rain. Those eyes, dark and solemn, stared back at her like a summons. Jesus, someone behind them breathed. A prospect, big-armed and uncertain, kept his distance at the mouth of the alley. The Hellwing patch caught the streetlight and winked like a warning. Mara recoiled as if the photograph burned. "Give it back." Her voice was small and thin, an honest coin held out in trembling hands. She'd sworn not to stay, not to let anyone pry. But the city had a way of folding harsh edges into tighter shapes. A night on these streets taught you which battles to pick. She had been picking none. Jace didn't hand it over. He sat back on his heels, and for the first time since she'd been sleeping in the underpass 2 weeks ago, Mara let herself look at him properly. Up close, his map of scars was more than trophies. One jagged line kissed the corner of his mouth and softened the predator angle. His eyes were a storm blue she'd seen once before, on a distant highway sign on a postcard, when she'd still believed in maps. There was a hardness there, of course. He was the president. He had to be.
But something else tightened around him as he regarded the photograph, as if the small image had opened some old wound. "You okay?" he asked quietly. Not a challenge, not to her, to the photograph. Mara chewed at the inside of her cheek. The lie wanted to march out, the practiced one she used with cops and nurses and men who thought they were saviors. Instead, she let the truth fall in a few scattered pieces. "That belonged to my—" She stopped. Names were traps. She had been taught that by fire. "It's mine." Silence pooled between them, full of rain and the distant hum of a city that moved on other people's schedules. A mouse of a sound, fear, gratitude, something needing a home, pushed behind Mara's ribs. The Brotherhood's hangar light buzzed on at the alley's end, and one of the older members, a man called Ives, with a face like road tar, stepped closer to supervise without speaking. The protocol of their world had rules about charity. Handouts were rare, sanctuary rarer still, and tokens of the street belonged to the street. A locket would be nothing in the ledger of territory and dues, but feelings were ledgers too, and Jace ran different ones. He closed the locket gently, then set it into Mara's palm as if it were a lit candle. "You got a name?" She said it like it was chosen for public use. Mara. The word tasted like the thrift store coat she'd stuffed around herself, the coat that had kept her alive through December and whatever winter had taken her last sense of belonging. "Were you sleeping?" His voice mapped the practical more than the personal, but when he asked, he moved a hair closer, and offered disguised as logistics. He was careful to keep the territory lines invisible, mostly company property, but the Brotherhood sheltered stray things when they had room. Under the bridge. It was the easy truth. The rest, the fugitive bones of her past, the Black Crow's whispered name, the reason she'd cut ties and run, stayed folded behind her teeth. She watched his face when she said it, looking for the pincer of pity. He didn't give her that. Instead, he gave her a measurement, as if deciding whether her place would fit in the spaces he protected. "You hungry?" he asked. The question should have been transactional, comfort for information, but it landed like mercy. Mara's stomach wanted the words to mean less than they did. Hunger had been an honest clock for a long time. Missing meals were easy to admit. Missing trust was an ache she'd kept secret. Yes. She could have lied and said no, that she preferred the gutters and the silence, because admitting want meant other hands could be laid on her. But the kind of hunger that hollowed your bones made honesty its own weapon, a small, sharp thing. He nodded once, like a man who made decisions the way other men breathed. "Come by the clubhouse. Clean up, eat."
He straightened, the bulk of his frame imposing in the narrow alley, and his wet hair clung to his brow like a crown of road grime. "We don't take folks in lightly," he added. "You do whatever the shop needs. No drama. You listen." Mara's laugh died quickly on the breath. "You want me to wash bikes for scraps?" There wasn't malice in it. Curiosity, maybe. The idea of being useful appealed to a part of her that remembered a time before sleeping bags and the smell of other people's laundry. Jace's half-smile was a landmark she didn't know how to navigate. "You'll be on probation," he said. "Wash bikes, sweep floors, mend leather. You earn your bed. You keep your head down." There was no room for negotiation in it. His voice was a ruler. She should have walked away then. Pride, however, is a poor currency for someone with wet feet and empty pockets. "Why would you—" She stopped. The question was an edge. Why would a Hellwing president stoop? Why would he bend the code for the likes of her? She searched his face, looking for the trap, and found instead a fissure of everything he'd learned to keep sealed. "Because I don't like seeing someone freeze over a photograph." He turned the locket in his fingers once, a gesture small as a benediction. "Because nobody should be alone when they're scared." His eyes found hers and held. "You show up tonight." Mara wanted to ask about the Brotherhood's rules. She wanted to ask if this was pity, a favor that would be used as leverage, a test. The answers might have saved her from future missteps. Instead, she heard herself say, decisively, "Okay." Survival is a fast learner. It speaks early and often. The clubhouse smelled like oil and coffee and old cigarettes, an honest stench that told the truth about the men who ran it. Inside, prospects and patched men glanced up, some with curiosity, some with the thin line of suspicion that kept their world orderly. Jace walked her through like she was a fragile piece of machinery and not a person who'd learned to move through noise unseen. He introduced her as someone from the alley and let his voice do the rest, neutral, unadorned, protective enough to make his club take the right shape around her. They set her by the workbench with rags and a bucket. A woman named Sarah handed her a clean shirt and didn't ask questions. Mara washed her hands like a confession, letting the cold water beat the dirt away. The photograph had slipped back into her pocket, clasped under the cloth of her thrift coat as if hiding from daylight. Jace lingered by the doorway until she lifted her head. "Dinner in half an hour," he said. "You don't answer to me if you don't want to, but you answer here, to the Brotherhood. That's how it runs." She wanted to say she understood, but suddenly the leather that hung on his shoulders looked heavier than it had a breath ago, as if carrying the weight of men who trusted him, men who would not tolerate softness that could be exploited. The membership of the Hellwing Brotherhood was a pyramid, with edges sharp enough to draw blood. Their codes were survival laws. For Jace to offer shelter, even probationary shelter, he was putting his authority on a thin, dangerous blade. Mara ate with her fingers, the food simple and hot and entirely sacred. She watched him across the table, as if he were a loom and she, some stray thread ready to be woven into pattern. There was a distance, an invisible line, between the president and the newcomer, but it was porous. His eyes found hers more than once, and each time his gaze carried a question she wasn't ready to answer. When he finally spoke, it wasn't about the locket or the photograph. "You ever have a brother?" he asked. The question surprised her into something like honesty. "No, not by blood anyway." "You?" He let out a breath that had rough edges. "Used to." His jaw tightened. "The Brotherhood is family in our way. You'll learn that quick." He tapped the table. "There are rules. One of them, nobody sleeps with a weakness you can kill a man with." He said it like an old proverb, one that had kept him alive through winters and wars. For the first time, Mara heard the other meaning. His willingness to protect her was a gamble. She was a liability. To stay would mean navigating a minefield of jealousies and tests.
Her fingers brushed the photo in her pocket like a rusty thing nearing the edge of the sink. The locket felt heavier now, charged. There was a risk in telling Jace about the Black Crows, the patrols that had hunted her, the fugitive names that clung to her skin. There was also risk in staying silent. If the Brotherhood discovered she'd been hiding ties to a rival club, the judgment would be swift and ugly. But there are evenings when the cold presses so hard against your ribs, you stop weighing future consequences. That night, as thunder rolled over the rooftop and the club's neon sign hummed like an omen, Mara climbed the narrow stair to the room that would be hers for as long as she earned it. In the shadows of the cot, she opened the locket like an offering and studied the face again. It was a boy's face, maybe 20, eyes solemn as if he'd been given the responsibility to watch over someone else. The photograph tugged at a loose thread inside her, a memory of a hand she once held, a name she had promised, a sound of laughter swallowed by sirens. She lay awake and listened to the Brotherhood breathing in rooms not far away, to the cadence of men who believed themselves immortal until they were not. Jace's footsteps passed below, slow as a heartbeat. She wanted to trust him. She wanted to trust the small mercy he'd granted. But trust was a fragile thing in a life built on running. The dilemma sat on her like a weight. Tell him the truth and risk losing the shelter that felt like a place to catch her breath, or bury the past and rest for a while under the uncertain mercy of a man who ruled with leather and iron.
Outside, rain silvered the world. Inside, the locket lay open on the bedside table, an invitation and a threat. Mara curled around it like a child on the first night of a new foster home, grateful, terrified, and aching to see if this unexpected refuge would become something more than shelter. For Jace, who had built a life of rigid lines and unbending codes, inviting her into his orbit had already loosened a seam he hadn't realized he could afford to let go. Neither of them suspected how that seam would unravel the Brotherhood, or that the small photograph would be the spark that set a whole house of loyalties on fire. But they both felt, in the quiet between rain and sleep, the hum of possibility, dangerous and dizzying, that comes when two battered people find in each other the temptation to risk everything for what could be love. The first time Jace washed the oil from Mara's hair, it felt like a breach of the rules he'd lived by. Getting close was a mistake, touching was making claims, but he did it anyway. She had fallen asleep at the bench from exhaustion, cheek against a wrench, and he had sat there watching her as if she were something fragile he'd found in the middle of a wreck and needed to salvage. The club smelled like rain and hot metal. The neon at the window painted his knuckles purple. He carried her to the washroom with the same carefulness he used when moving a bike that had tipped, hands steady, no hurry. She woke at the cold water and the smell of lemons from the cleaner Sarah used when she wanted to pretend the clubhouse had a gentler life. For a moment she blinked up at him, disoriented by the closeness of his face and the way the light caught the silver at his temple. He met her with a look that felt like an assessment and an apology all at once. "You should sleep more," he said, the words unexpectedly soft. Mara swallowed, the memory of sleeping with one eye open uncoiling like a reflex. Sleep was a risk, and yet she slept because survival had been wearing her down like a belt that finally snapped. "I'm fine," she lied. The lie was old and comfortable, the way a coat slips over shoulders. It hung between them, harmless enough in the dim light. He didn't press it. Instead, he smoothed her hair, working a tug not free with calloused fingers. "You got anything you need to tell me?" he asked. "You tell me the truth. I don't like surprises." That was the truest thing he'd said so far. Mara watched him, saw the tiny shift in his face, something worn thinner by years on the road and the weight of keeping men together when they were prone to fracture. She wanted to ask him why he kept coming back to the photograph in her pocket, why his gaze frequented her the way a hawk circles a meadow. Instead, she pretended sleep would reclaim her, and when she stepped back into the world he had made a place for her in, she found that being useful was addictive. Washing bikes became her currency. The Hellwings shop spoke to her in the language of torque and grease. It was honest, mechanical, and merciless in a way she could understand. Sarah taught her how to stitch torn seats without puckering, how to sand chrome until it looked like a promise, and Mara found relief in method. There were limits to what the Brotherhood wanted from an outsider on probation. No involvement in club affairs, no passing info, no fraternization beyond what kept the shelter intact. But there was also a small generosity in letting someone prove themselves. She learned to earn her bread and to measure men's moods by the way they grunted when she handed them a wrench.
The push and pull between Jace and Mara was threaded through small things. The way he stationed himself at the far table when prospects were testing the boundaries. The way he would walk her to the back gate at night, though he said it was because the alley lights were unreliable. He would stand in the rain and watch the road as if he were reading its mood, then turn and ask if she needed anything. She learned the cadence of his questions, how they were practical before they were personal. Occasionally, when the clubhouse was quiet and the beer ran low, his armor softened. He would strip off the stoic president posture and let a tired joke loose, or he'd share a cigarette without comment, small confessions that made him human and not simply a symbol of power. But the Brotherhood did not trust softness easily. Rumors in clubs are like leaked oil. If you don't wipe them up, they spread. Even as Mara began to build small routines, the outer edges of the Brotherhood watched with something like hunger. Prospects looked at her as a potential distraction they could manipulate, or worse, an opening they could exploit to climb faster. A man named Cole, teeth too white for someone who snapped a spine for a joke, hovered with a grin and a leer that made her shoulders tense. He would offer to show her how to tighten a bolt, and his hand would linger too long. One night she found him at her back, watching as she stitched a tear in a jacket. He grinned like a wolf. "You got someone running your life for you now, sweetheart?" he said, voice oily. "President's Pat? Lucky girl." Mara's hand tightened around the needle. There is a way to answer threats without making them worse. She swallowed the retort and met his stare with something colder, the thing learned from nights when words were as dangerous as fists. "I work for my keep," she said. "You should try it." Cole laughed but left her alone after that. The threat, however, had been placed. A seed had been sown. Jace saw the exchange from across the room and his jaw tightened. Later, in the quiet of the office, he told Cole to move his hands or his mouth. Cole laughed and told his friends about love in strange places. That was the Brotherhood's currency, stories about who'd slept with whom, and thereby who'd be compromised. Jace's decisions about Mara became less private the more he allowed her inside the fortress of his club. That knowledge fretted at him the way a loose screw effaces the integrity of a whole machine. Mara learned to navigate that world by staying mostly invisible, working by day and sleeping deep by night. Yet small betrayals accumulated. A prospect leaving a half-empty mug in her space, cigarettes smoked near her cot. The kind of microaggressions that signaled the club's acceptance had a cost. She pressed against those costs like a mariner against wind, head down, hands on the ropes. A different kind of pushland appeared one rain-blurred morning when a van with a black crow painted on its side idled outside the garage. It was a small thing at first. Mara saw the silhouette bent over a map through the steamed-up window. Then the van drove off. Jace noticed. He had an instinct for territorial markers the way a bloodhound knows scent. He stiffened, the way a man tightens when someone speaks his name in a crowd. The Hellwing's vice president, Clay, was a man who wore suspicion like a belt. He pulled Jace aside that night with a sort of measured voice that meant trouble. "Tracks," he muttered. "Black Crow tracks near the East Bridge. They've been moving closer." Jace listened, shoulders hardening. "We'll sweep tonight," he said. It was a command, one that sent men to their boots. And yet he hesitated a heartbeat before adding, "Keep watch on the edges. No one goes solo." Mara overheard it. She felt the name in her chest like a rat gnawing at her ribs. The Black Crows were weather in her past, a storm she'd run from. They were not just a rival club. They were the reason she learned to sleep with one eye open, why she kept the locket and the photograph pressed to the place where a heart would be. The probability of them finding her here made the air in her lungs taste metallic. She could say nothing and sleep through the danger. She could tell Jace and risk everything. She found herself at an impossible fork, self-preservation or honesty. The Brotherhood's sweep that night was routine, a show of power that reassured the club. Prospects fanned out, boots slapping the wet pavement in a rhythm that Mara's stomach hollow. She stayed inside, hands folded, while Jace stood at the doorway, horizon lines sharp in rain. He was a sentinel. He watched the road like it was a wound, and he had no analgesic. She wanted to tell him then. She wanted to confess that the locket was a tether to something dangerous, and that the boy in the photo was more than memory. He was a breadcrumb trail through a war that had once taken her family, through a name that could ignite the wrong men. When Clay came back with word of nothing found, the clubhouse breathed easier. But the knowledge that the Black Crows had been close lingered like the smoke of a candle. The club's men traded theories and old grudges, and every glint of metal in conversation became a knife. Jace remained unswerving in his patrols, pacing like a man who believes motion prevents memory. Mara watched him and saw how easily he shouldered responsibility. For the club, for men who would give him their lives, for a rooftop of rules that were sometimes armor and sometimes prison. She tried to keep her head down after that, until the night when she was handed a jacket to mend that felt oddly familiar. The leather had the faint smell of a different alliance, cheap cologne and exhaust, and tucked in the pocket was a cassette tape, labeled in handwriting she'd seen once before in a hospital room, in a name she had sworn to forget. Her fingers brushed the creased letters, and the world shifted 3 degrees. The cassette could be a wrong turn. It could be anything. But to Mara, it was a hook into a past she'd knocked out the walls around. She almost put it back. Survival had taught her the logic of disappearing when danger nodded in your direction. Yet the tape hummed in her palm like something alive. She heard her own speechless thought. What if this is how the Black Crows found me here? What if this is proof that the past has teeth and is hungry? The pull toward caution was loud. Jace's face flashed through her mind, the steadiness in his eyes that had become a small, safe place. She could imagine the look in Clay's eyes if he smelled a traitor in their midst. She kept the tape. That night, in the thin hours, she put it under her pillow and listened to the sound of her own breath. The photograph felt heavier in the pocket of her coat, like it had been waiting for her to make a move. The dilemma sharpened. Tell Jace and risk losing the shelter and possibly his trust, or keep the secret and risk being used as leverage when the Black Crows decided to make a statement. When the confrontation finally came, it was not a dramatic raid or a broken window. It was a whisper that translated into action. Clay found the cassette while doing inventory in a distracted hour, the sort of small task that reveals mistakes when men are tired and patience thin. He spat language like gravel when he noticed the handwriting. He showed it to a couple of prospects who liked to feel important by breaking things down into conspiracies. They circled Mara that afternoon like vultures at an exposed bone. "Where'd this come from?" Clay demanded, standing over the bench where Mara worked. His voice had an edge, a measurement of betrayal. She met him with the practiced calm of someone whose nerves had been tempered by fire. "Must have been left in a jacket I was repairing." "By a Black Crow, huh?" Cole sneered, showing his teeth. "Funny how these things land in our hands, ain't it?" Mara's heart slammed into her throat. She could feel the room tightening, breath shortening, faces tilted like knives. She looked at Jace, seeking the one person who could turn the tide. He stood in the doorway, caught between the loyalty he owed to his men and the inexplicable claim he felt toward her. His jaw worked. For a breath, he seemed to consider ordering them to back off, to sweep the room and declare the matter closed. Instead, he said, low and carefully, "Clay, seal it in evidence. We don't make moves without the president's say, either way." Clay's eyes flicked to Jace and then away, the vice president's posture folding into obsequiousness. "Yes, sir." He stuffed the cassette into his pocket like a prize. "We'll handle it." Mara felt the room exhale. The crisis had been deflected, not resolved. Men returned to their beers, but the air had changed. She saw the hunger in their eyes now when they looked at her, the calculus running through their heads about leverage and fear. That night she went to bed with the knowledge that some men would believe the Black Crows had been stalking her, and that meant she was a vulnerability the Brotherhood might exploit, or punish. Jace watched her from the darkened doorway for a long time before he came up the stairs. He sat at the edge of her cot and kept a distance equal to the one imposed by their world's rules. "You okay?" he asked. It was both a question and a test. She closed her eyes, the weight of the locket, the cassette, the photograph threading through her like a woven thread. "No," she admitted. It was the first real truth between them that wasn't about work or food or sleep. "I'm not okay." He hummed a sound, a small concession. "Then tell me something I can work with." His voice had a command that felt familiar and dangerous. To give him the truth would mean asking for his protection in a way that would change the balance of power between them. To lie would be to invite the past to catch up in a way that could kill them both. Mara felt the tug of the truth like a rope fraying at its middle. She opened her mouth and closed it. The room seemed to tilt. "I used to be tied to the Black Crows," she said finally, the words leaving a taste of metal. "Not by choice. By debt. By a name I didn't get to choose. I left. I ran." Jace's face tightened like a fist. For a moment she saw not the man who had offered her shelter, but the president who protected the patch above his name. "Why are they here?" he asked. The question was small, practical, an angle for strategy, but the undercurrent was the same as before. What did that mean for the Brotherhood? For him? She had nothing else to give him but the one truth that could either free her or doom them both. "I don't know," she said. "They looked for me before. They might be looking again." Silence draped over them, thick as a flag. Outside, rain began again with patient insistence. Jace's fingers tapped the wood of the cot as if calculating. He had always lived by a ledger, credits, debts, codes. To protect Mara would be to spend political capital he didn't know he had. To abandon her would be to prove the Brotherhood's code unbreakable, but his heart untrustworthy.
He thought of Clay and the prospects and the thin tongues in the club that could turn affection into accusation. He thought of the photograph in her pocket and the boy who stared steady from its faded paper, and he felt something dangerous and irrevocable loosen in him. "We'll keep you," he said finally, "but you're on probation. You tell me everything I need to know when I need to know it. No secrets. And you stay close to the clubhouse when we sweep." Mara swallowed down questions. What if they find out the truth? What if he leaves? And nodded. It was not a bargain sealed by romance. It was a pact made in a war zone between two people who had learned how to survive. The pull between them tightened into a reality that would demand choices, and the push of the Brotherhood's suspicion pressed in from all sides like the closing of a door. Out on the street, a crow's call echoed in the night as if mocking them. 2 syllables of a name that had once been a sentence. Inside, Jace's palm covered Mara's hand for a beat that stretched into something like a vow. It was not perfect. It carried the weight of rules and consequence. But it was a hand held in the dark, and sometimes that was the only way to know you weren't alone. The first act of trust had been given, and with it came a torrent of consequences neither of them yet understood. The Brotherhood's wheels began to turn, and somewhere, someone heard the shift. The push and pull of allegiance, danger, and desire had only intensified. The next movement would be harder and louder than either of them could stomach. The room smelled of damp leather and old grudges when Clay stood up from the bench with the cassette in his hand. He didn't announce what he'd found. He let the small storm swell, and watched the faces in the shop turn toward him like birds toward a thrown seed. The mood in a clubhouse is a living thing. One note can set it into motion, and the note Clay chose was hunger. "You kept something from us, Prez," he said, voice smooth like slick oil. The words landed and people leaned in, because a president who kept a secret had made himself vulnerable. And vulnerability is a currency everyone wants to spend. Jace's head lifted slowly. His shoulders tightened in a way that Mara's gut clenched. "What are you talking about?" Clay didn't have to answer for long. He let the cassette dangle from his fingers as if it were a noose. "Found this in her repair kit. Handwriting on the tape, Black Crow. Someone's been stitching us a nice little betrayal." He let the implication hang, then smiled like a man who had just folded 3 aces into a royal flush. The room hummed with the low, insect tone of suspicion. Eyes flicked to Mara like they'd found a new game to play. Cole's grin was a predator's. Sarah's face, normally a steady map, went milk white and then iron hard. She had always been the club's moral compass, and now she swung between creed and compassion like a pendulum that had come loose. Mara stood frozen. The cassette hit the table with a small, final sound. Clay's hand closed on it, and the sound of the plastic snapping in the silence was the sound of her life being counted and found wanting. "You've been keeping things from us," Clay said again, louder, a command as much as an accusation. "You tell the room what you are." Mara's throat moved. The moment had arrived in the way the worst storms arrive. Sudden. Total. She could feel the backwash of every choice that had led to this bench. The long nights under bridges, the small mercies, the locket, Jace's handover. Every step had been a narrowing road. Now she saw the men who'd chosen her into the Bonneville light, and in that light, their faces were less tolerant than she'd imagined. She swallowed, the sound small and raw. The tape was in a jacket. You don't what? Cole barked. You don't lie to us, sweetheart.
You don't bring Black Crow pieces into our shop and say it was an accident." Jace rose with the quiet that had always been his armor. When he moved, the room stiffened. He was not a man about to be spoken over. "Enough." His voice was a blade wrapped in silk. "Clay, you close your mouth and you bring that to me. We're not a courtroom." Clay's jaw ticked. "We talk about this as a club, Red. We can't have people with ties to the Crows living under our roof." There it was, the word tie. Small, legal, fatal. A tie could be cut, or it could be the rope that strangled them. Mara's hands trembled so hard she could have dropped the needle she'd been holding. She thought the worst of the Brotherhood had been their indifference. She hadn't expected its ravenous need to prune anything that threatened its purity. Jace stepped in front of her as if she were a shield, a living barrier between rumor and action. "She hasn't done anything wrong," he said. The phrasing was careful, deliberate. "You found a tape. You didn't find intent." Clay snorted. "Intent follows a pattern, boss. We all got patterns here." He opened his palm and turned the cassette so the label caught the light. The handwriting was something simple. A name, a date. And to most men it would have been meaningless. To Mara it was a match struck in dry grass. The room waited. Even the neon at the window seemed to dim, as if pausing to listen better. Mara felt her life nutcrack in the hinge of that silence. "I knew a boy once," she said, voice thin. "He saved me. She stopped. The confession tasted like old rope. "He wore a Black Crow patch." The sound that came from the shop was not entirely sound, more the rustle of a trap closing. Jace's face didn't change. His hands curled into the pockets of his jacket, knuckles white through leather. "What did you say?" he asked, because presidents ask for facts when they are afraid, and he needed facts like a man needs a map. She forced the words out. His name was Emmett. The name had a way of making the lights flicker.
He gave me the locket. He told me to run and to never tell. The rest of it lurked like teeth. She tasted salt brine memory and siren static. He saved me from something I can't explain. I thought I left it all behind. Emmett. The name hit them like a shrapnel shard. Jace's fingers stamped so hard on the workbench the wood complained. The photograph in Mara's pocket, the small, faded face, suddenly aligned with a missing brother, a man Jace had mourned quietly for years. The locket, the rusted hinge, was no longer a street relic. It was a relic of Jace's life before he'd become the king of an asphalt kingdom. "Emmett?" Jace's voice was softer than a warning. It had that strangled look of someone hearing a name he thought buried alive dig itself up in his chest. "You knew him by that name?" Mara nodded. "He used to call me." She stopped before the name could fall. Names in her world had been currency. To give one away was to buy a debt. But somewhere between time and terror, she had learned that sometimes you had to spend what you feared. "Leah," she said at last. The name tumbled out like a confession and left her raw. "Children called me Leah before they called me anything else. Emmett saved me. He told me to run. He gave me the locket and said if I ever stopped, I was to look for it." The room shifted. You could see it in the way men moved away from the bench as if expecting something explosive. Sarah took a step forward and then stopped, fingers pressed to her throat. Even Clay's bravado cracked to a sneer that didn't reach his eyes. "Emmett Mercer," he said slowly, tasting the syllables like someone testing poison. "Missing Emmett. You mean Emmett Mercer?" Jace's jaw worked. The years of not knowing and the brittle control it required all pressed up against this tiny truth. Mara watched him the way you watch a storm roll in, expectant and impotent. She had offered a hand and had no idea what it would drag into the open. "You knew him," Jace said finally. He wasn't asking if she'd known him by sight. He was asking how deep the current between their lives ran. "You knew my brother." She nodded.
He helped me get free from something. He left the patch and he told me not to follow. He said there would be trouble if I stayed connected. He gave me the photograph because he said I should have something to remember family by. Jace leaned over the bench and slammed his fist down once, a crack of sound that made the room startle. Emmett disappeared 15 years ago. He said words like stones. We filed, we searched, we bled. His voice broke and he swallowed. If Emmett's name is in the same sentence as the Crows, then we're walking the line between grief and treason. The group's dynamic changed in a pulse. Loyalty reconfigured in the space of two brows. Clay's face brightened with the neat gleam of confirmation. See, you were hiding something personal with him. You have a soft spot.
How many times have we told you, Rook, no softness around a leash your enemies can pull? It was the first fracture, thin and fast. Men who'd once followed a man because they believed in him now saw the bone of his weakness to be exploited. Whispering started like a slow leak. Guesses became allegations. Old fights, they were tinder, and Clay was keeping a match in his pocket. Jace's control wrenched between the man he had to be and the brother he had lost. He turned to Mara with exhaustion in his eyes that was almost a plea. You should have told me, he said, as if it were a sin she'd committed against him more than a survival tactic against predators. You should have put it on the table. Because I thought if I put it down, they'd come for me, she said. The ache in her voice made her newness to the Brotherhood look like a betrayal. I thought it would be safer if I kept it hidden. You hid it under our roof, Cole muttered. That's using us as a shield. The room boiled like a kettle about to scream. Sarah grabbed Mara's arm with gentle but iron hold. This isn't good, she whispered, and there was the tremor of something like fear for Jace that made Mara feel both selfish and blameful at once. Sarah's loyalty to the club wrestled with something bigger than her patch. Outside, the rain had started again in earnest, a sound like a million small fingers drumming on metal. The weather matched the mood, relentless, impartial. Whoever you were, emperor or stray, you were subject to it. The fracture spread beyond the immediate accusations. Men who once nodded to Jace out of respect now questioned his judgment aloud. If the Prez is soft enough to shelter a Mercer-linked outsider, one prospect spat, what's he soft enough to do next? Jace didn't answer with violence or denial. His hand found Mara's across the bench and squeezed it. Not to shield her from accusation, the gesture would never be seen that way by those who wanted him to fall, but to anchor himself. We do not make decisions on rumor, he said. We find facts. Clay's laugh was bitter. You're going to protect her while facts collect like cockroaches under a floorboard? She brings a Crow connection to our house and you ask us to wait? It was the beginning of lines drawn in the clubhouse, and every line is a fracture until it becomes a chasm. Men gathered in small knots, debating not strategy but sacrifice. Loyalties were bargaining chips. Jace felt the weight of the presidency press down like winter. Mara watched him from beneath the storm that had become a room full of men whose lives she had cracked open. The hand he'd offered had become dangerous terrain. It alone could cost him his club or his life. She had come for shelter and found instead a mirror of her own past, choices that punished you for the small kindnesses you let yourself keep. If you want us to be a family, make it clean, Clay said finally, voice cold and polished.
Either she's one of us, with papers and truth, or she's gone. We don't harbor liabilities. It hung there like a verdict. Jace's face tightened. He could see the vote written in the set of mouths around the room. The Brotherhood that had once been his fortress was deciding whether his heart would be its undoing. Mara's mouth tasted like iron. She had the full truth in her pocket, the photograph, the locket, the cassette that had the Black Crow handwriting. But even as she considered revealing everything to clear him, she realized the true cost. The name she had kept would not just blow the Brotherhood apart, it would bring the very people she'd fled to their doorstep. I will tell you everything, she said. And the room stilled, because in a world of half-truths, a promise to full truth is an earthquake. But I need to know you'll protect me when I do. Jace's gaze met hers with a fierceness that made the others flinch. I will, he said, and it sounded like both an oath and a challenge. But this isn't just about you, Mara. It's about everyone who puts his life on the line under this patch. You understand that. She did. The knowledge came quick and severe. Love in a brotherhood is not a private thing. It comes with public consequence. To ask for protection was to ask a man to gamble his legacy against the truth of her past. Clay's lips curled. Then we do it by the book, he said. We convene the chapter, we hear the story, we decide. He nodded once, as if the motion were automatic and righteous. The room split along the path he'd carved. The fracture was now visible, and it bled into everything. Men who'd once been brothers in principle now circled for position. Jace's authority, always tested, was now in the ring of the club's eyes. Mara's shelter had become a powder keg, and through it all, the shadow of the Black Crows, no longer a rumor but a ghost with a name, waited beyond the neon, listening for the sound of a club about to choose. The chapter room smelled like burned coffee and tension. Clay stood like a jury, the cassette still in his palm as if he could squeeze the truth out of its plastic. Men lined the benches, faces hard as cast iron, waiting for a verdict Jace could not give without losing himself or the brotherhood he'd built. The neon outside painted the room in blood and blue. Mara's pulse was a drum in her throat. She had said she would tell the truth. She had not understood until now how much it would sound like treason. Start talking, Clay said. The patience was gone from him. He wanted a quick cut, a simple solution. We hear what she has and we close the file. Mara swallowed. The words came as if they'd been waiting quietly for their cue. She told them about Emmett, about the night he dragged her from a back alley and handed over a locket he'd said to keep, about the debts and threats that had followed her like vultures.
She said his last name and watched the room split as if someone had thrown a stone into calm water. She told them about the tape and why she'd kept it, because it contained a voice that named streets and safe houses, because it was proof that Emmett had been trying to disappear her into a map that might still be traced. Silence pushed up against the rafters. Men shifted in their seats. Where the accusation had been a blade, her confession now was a flare, bright and undeniable. Clay's face folded into a new shape, rage braided with triumph. There you go, he spat. He's got a history. You hid it. You lied by omission. That's not protection, it's leverage. Jace moved then, the way a man does when a decision becomes violent if delayed. He stepped into the center of the room and took off his patch, the white skull on black leather. And he did something none of them expected. He laid it on the table where everyone could see. The motion was less a surrender than a declaration. This ain't about leverage, he said, voice flat as a slab. This is about a woman I offered shelter to. If any of you think I've put the Brotherhood at risk because I did a humane thing, you can have my patch. He pushed it forward like a coin tossed into a storm. You can vote me out if you want. You can have the letter of the law, and I'll take what's left of me and go. The room jolted. Clay's sneer cracked into something like a smile. Is that what you're offering, Red? Your head? Your club? Jace's eyes were calm, and in that calm was a fierceness that disarmed argument. I'm offering the truth. I will not hand my president's throne over to a man who'd trade a human being for political advantage. He looked at the men, one by one, and then at Mara. I will not let you make a martyr of compassion. Murmurs rose. Some men shifted toward Clay, hungry for a leader who would never bend. Others looked as if they'd been measured and found wanting in a world where mercy had a price. Sarah's hand found Mara's, grounding her. The vote began, but before it settled into paper and patch, a new sound cut the room. A heavy engine, a low call, and then the unmistakable rattle of gunfire from outside, like a broken throat. All at once the windows were night, and the night was metal. The Black Crows had decided to stop waiting. Chaos snapped the chapter into motion. Clay barked orders, but with ununanimous backing, his commands had the brittle quality of paper armor. Black-clad figures surged through the club's doors, flashlights, crows painted on sleeves, a pair of silhouettes framed in the doorway like executioners. Bullets bit the wood, and men hit the floor. Jace showed Mara down without thinking, taking the bite of a ricochet in his shoulder. Leather split with a sound like a small animal dying. Get down, he yelled, and his voice was the same one that had led men across highways and into battle. He threw himself in front of her like a hand across a flame.
Mara saw stars and his face bleeding, and for the first time, the scale of what he'd risked was not theory, but a living, gasping thing. She moved then,
too fast for the world that had taught her to hide. A prospect lunged and missed, and Mara's hand found the cassette-clipped pocket, the thing Clay had treated as evidence. In a second that felt like a lifetime, she pulled it free, ran for the side door, and disappeared into the storm of men and bullets. She wasn't running this time. She was bait. The Black Crows pressed the attack, eyes on the woman they claimed was one of them. Clay, suddenly fierce with vindication, lifted his piece and moved toward the opening like a butcher toward his right. Jace's voice cut through like a saw. "Clay, no!" He didn't say it as a command to a subordinate. He said it as a plea to a brother he'd once trusted. The next moments became water and heat. Men I had thought on either side of a line shifted like iron filings when a magnet dropped, some toward Jace, some toward the promise of punishment. The clubhouse dissolved into a tangle of bodies. In the flash of a muzzle, Mara turned and ran back, toward Jace. She found him slumped against the bench, blood dark on his ribs where a slug had found him. He was laughing, some broken, ridiculous sound. "Stupid," he said, weak and fierce. "Don't you dare die on me, Mara." He gripped her hand like an anchor. She lifted her face and saw him truly, blood, rain, the wet of the world streaking his jaw. The soft parts of him had become a hazard and a salvation. She stood over him, and in the electric clarity of the night, she did the only thing that made sense. She told him, in a voice that cracked but would not break, the truth she had kept like a leaking river. She told him everything about Emmett and the tracks that led to a safe house, and the cassette she'd kept that named places the Black Crows still used. She told him so he could use it to end the fight. Between shots, Jace lived again, the sound like someone freeing a bird. "You always were stubborn, Leah," he rasped. "Good to know I picked my weakness well." She knelt, hands on his jacket, fingers finding the wound as if measuring the cost. "I love you," she said, the admission not planned and not prepared for, but truer than anything they'd built in the silence between them. The words were not a plea for protection. They were a weapon of their own, blunt and absolute. He smiled, bleeding but alive in the way only those who have been on the edge and returned can be. "Then don't leave me to be stupid alone," he whispered. He used his free hand to take the locket from her pocket and pressed it into her palm. "You keep it, not because it's yours, but because you gave it back alive." Mara's fingers tightened on the locket.
She rose with him, and in a movement that felt like reclaiming, the Brotherhood's fractured halves decided. Some men fell in with Clay's purge, angry at the cost of mercy. Others, moved by Jace's open wound and the truth of his sacrifice, stood with him. The Black Crows were beaten back that night not by a unified front, but by the messy, stubborn human thing Jace had dared to be. By dawn, the clubhouse smelled of spent gunpowder and something else, first light. Men counted losses and tended wounds. The Brotherhood had changed. Some patches had been surrendered quietly, others surrendered loudly. Jace's shoulder would scar in a line of red that matched one Mara had once imagined drawing across a map. She sat by him, chain of patchless and patched men moving around them, and the locket lay open in her palm like a small, defiant sun. He looked at her, the president and the man at once, and in the way his hand closed around hers, there was a kind of covenant born not of code, but of blood and choice. Clay's council had wanted a clean house. Jace's choice had made the house messy and honest. There would be consequences, trials and deals and reckonings, but that night, with the rain slowing to a forgiving patter, Mara leaned into the man who had chosen her over his throne. "I'll stand with you," she said. The words were simple. They were dangerous. They were true. He smiled, pain pricking the edges like confetti on a wound. "Ride with me then," he said. "We'll rewire the Brotherhood. Make it something that keeps people alive, instead of just making sure we survive." They sat with that possibility as the dawn unfurled, the world outside a road that could be reclaimed, rebuilt, or burned. Jace's sacrifice had split the club and saved Mara. Mara's truth had broken the complacent safety of silence. Together, bleeding and raw, they found in the morning the first promise of a different kind of family, one where love and loyalty were no longer enemies, but maps you learned to follow through storm and toward a new horizon. The dawn came slow and insistent,
washing the clubhouse in the pallid light of a town that had watched too many nights be decided at the muzzle. Men moved around the busted counter like men in a confessional, some with guilt, some with new hard edges. Clay packed a bag while his mouth formed threats he would later call principled. A handful of prospects went with him, their loyalty purchased at the price of mercy. Others stayed, the ones whose faces had shifted when Jace bared his wound, and with it, his choice. Sarah sat on the workbench, sleeves rolled, hands steady as she stitched a tear in a torn patch. She looked